promo commercial going here. There we go. A little clickety-clack. Welcome to Evolution Hour. Here we are on the 6th of January. Isn't it nice to know we made it to the 6th of January? Isn't that splendid? There's all the cute little clocks and clickety-clacks and Troubles in Paradise, the methodology of creationism, the website, tortuganwordpress.com. By all means, make use of the stuff in there and share away all those cute little PDFs. And away we are on another Evolution Hour. I will again go through and thank all of our patrons and stuff right off the bat, under the circumstance that occasionally YouTube burps. Especially on this night with panic in Washington, D.C., and all sorts of weird stuff going on. Who knows how long the connection will go. So let me thank our patrons right off the bat, our colleague Tendril, Colton, Eric, Cyrus, Zeshi, researchers Travis, Ian, Convert Me, Stephen Early, Eat Neil, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Apologia, Ben Simpson, Speed of Sound, Sister Researchers, Durango, Totus Real, Christopher Johnson, our friends. Hello, Vesta. Daniel, Steve Bauman, Meridale Beddoes, Insects Are Cool, Devin Miranda Reeves, Morton Nielsen, Paula Skeptic, Papalopicus, Bo Rasmussen, who's a little under the weather over there. He's has been exposed to COVID. We're crossing fingers on it. Slade, come here. Hi, how it's going? Muddling along here. Let me get here. And Alex Stone and Paul Williams, and then also our legacy patrons, Jen, Jody, Mike, Don, Keith, Andrew Dyer, Yui, Mona, Brad, Daniel, Nyanya, Staggles, Sun, Sky, Stone, Ugly German, Truce, Everett, and Sewer. All of you helped out at various times, and I am constantly grateful. Unless you live in a cave, you may be unaware, could possibly be unaware of the fact that we had rampaging Trumpistas trying to stop the electoral count in the Congress. Fortunately, even my hyper-conservative representative, Kathy McMorris Rogers, who had supported this electoral recount thing, backed off from it today as a consequence of the action. So that's a slight upside there. Apparently, Trump's Twitter account has been suspended, which for like so many hours. I tweeted him when I got on Twitter this morning saying basically that he's scum and he needs to apologize for all of this, leading people astray, and he needs to give all the money back that he scammed and all the sundry little things. And he's just a common thief. And on January 20th, he won't be our president anymore. Maybe sooner. Theoretically, the Congress could impeach him. Theoretically, Pence, amazingly, the American Council of Businessmen or National, whatever, the business group, they just issued a memorandum asking Pence to get the cabinet together and invoke the 25th Amendment and remove Trump from office, which they can do legally. I'm not expecting any of that to happen unless there it goes. So enough of cheery politics. Apparently the Congress is still in session and they're counting the votes as they're supposed to. It didn't change a damn thing, as anybody would have thought it would. This show, as those of you who have been following me are aware, I've been going through Replacing Darwin, Nathaniel Jensen's creationist book, which is not that thick of a volume compared to my Rocks Were There with Jackson and Evolution Slam Dunk. And in case you like a good novel read, there's Paralogs of Phileas Fogg. His book has no index. It has no reference bibliography. It has footnotes, which I've been going through block by block, week by week, to indicate, is this really good documentation? Is it accurate? Is he misleading information? I'm finishing up now with the biogeography chapter. I think there'll be only one more installment on it that I'll go into next week. But on this one, at last, a tiny shoe drops, which is that Jensen cites some creationists. And it's interesting that he does it here. He himself is a creationist. His whole argument is a young earth creationist position, and so he has a perfect right to present his own views, but he has avoided up until this point on page, oh gosh, where are we at? About page 120 something, ever drawing on his own side's ammunition. with biogeography being so blatantly evolutionary, which is the distribution of animals in time and space, and how understanding where they lived and when can explain what happened next and what happened earlier, um, that you get into a problem if creationists try to enter the field. And so he cites two creationists, Kurt Wise and Croxton's 2003 thing on rafting, which ironically comes up in regular evolutionary thinking, that if you have a body of water separating two land masses and you have two critters that are very closely related, how did one get there? How did they get there? Either they were specially created, Zot, or they evolved somewhere and migrated there in some form or another. And if the animal is small enough, then occasional rafting of where a critter is up in a tree or a shrub when a storm causes landslide and a chunk of land drops off into the ocean with plants on it, and the little critters, their little nests of family, are there and they float. And if that happens too slowly, they'll probably die. But once in a while, they'll have enough to nibble on, and yipes, they hit land, and away we go. So this would be a relatively rare event, but it's observed. We have actual observations of small animals being rafted on small slobs of real estate. And so the idea that this would happen occasionally in the past, enough to account for the distribution of particular critters, particularly small ones, is an idea that creationists tended to avoid before, because their time frame doesn't allow for that kind of thing, and they envisaged all of the migrations taking place directly from Mount Ararat on the world as we now know it. That's creationism back in the 1960s era. They did not allow plate tectonics. They didn't allow continental drift. None of that. But as we moved into the 1990s, when it was painfully obvious that the entire geological revolution going on and plate tectonics wasn't going to go away, creationists began to adopt aspects of plate tectonics. And so now you get dangling implications that the pre-flood world was like Pangea, a single continent, which would make it easier. They wouldn't have to have rafting episodes. But yet there's also some groups of creationists that realize that maybe because of the way the flood is sequencing, and if they want to drag in too much of the earlier world to account for the geological frame in the flood, they're going to have the pre-flood world something other than Pangea. And they're going to have Pangea as a way station, so that if you look at the Creation Museum that Ken Ham does, hi Sladium, everybody say hi to everybody. If you have a Pangea world taking place during the flood, then they're dealing with a Rodinia world, and then a Pangea either flood or post-flood, and then our world occurring after that. That's a really constrained time frame. The point is that with the flood taking place, 2350 BC, thereabouts, and then animals distributing and speciating and doing all sorts of eating as we move along. Well, do the ones that this Wise and Croxton paper, and there's also this Statham paper from 2015, and I'll be putting the links. One of them is available at the college that puts up Kurt Wise's stuff in general, and then the other one is from Creation.com. Those are the ones that Jensen thought was going to be relevant to this issue. For those who are very curious, go ahead and download those when I get the links up on that and read them and see, do they really go into much detail about where the land masses were and what critters lived where and how you really get to things other than in a generic way? No. And I don't anticipate that ever happening, because that young Earth creationist time frame required smooshing so much stuff together in such a completely nonsensical way that they're never going to make it all fit. They might be able to theoretically make one little slice fit, but what's going on next door and next door of that and next door of that over regions and all the rest. And so even when you look at Tim Clary and all that, when they put up talking about the mega sequences in the geological record, that's one of the latest buzzwords. Sock sequence and all that. And Jackson and I are going to include a section on that in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. We'll be going into a little bit more about all of that stuff. Oh, David H. Made it before at half the hour mark this time. Yeah, I last couple of weeks I was often starting rather early, especially last week because Jackson was able to show for the show because he's been working most of the time and he just happened to have that Wednesday off, and so we kind of launched in advance, and there were all sorts of problems over fiddly bits. But I've been going back to the setting up this as a scheduled program on Restream, and that seems to be nicer. I'm able to see the chats and all that kind of stuff. So those are the procedures that I make use of. Anyway, there is an obvious problem for any creationist model trying to account for the Americas. How do you get, and Australia as well, that's in the same ballpark. Australia with its very distinctive fauna, a bunch of very unusual marsupial forms. And whereas the standard geological model has the time frame to work out, as a landmass is moving and bumping into another landmass, and there's faunal interchanges, and then it might be pulled away through rifting, and now it's more isolated, and they start developing specialized forms. Well, the Americas have been disconnected, except at the North Pole end, by where it bumps up into Asia, and depending upon sea level change, you can have faunal interchange there for quite a long while. After the dinosaurs checked out, South America was isolated. There was no Isthmus of Panama linking North and South America together. That's a relatively recent event from, I think, like 5 years ago, something like that, which cut off the sea but connected up the land. And that's when the big killer birds and that were the big predators down in South America went extinct, as all of these leopard types that were coming down from the south. Although the little little possums in South America, they spread all over the place. They have a nice low hunkered down niche there, and all this busy stuff is going on with the big critters up above, and the little possums doing their little thing and spreading a little here and going over here. And there's a big set of literature on that. Everybody that wants to criticize creationism ought to bear all of that biogeographical issue in mind and keep an eye out for the ball that doesn't drop, which is, what do they think the land masses were when this event took place? And so if he wants to bring up particular taxa, he needs to do that. Jensen's writing in 2017, he should have had more of an operation on there. From what I've looked through and seen from other criticism of the book, there's no point where he settles this issue. And I think what he's doing here in this stupid footnote is he's pumping it over to creationists as though they had solved this problem as well. The other half of the show, which I will allude to then in advance, again, just in case the connection breaks, has to do with dear old David Klinghoffer. Well, let me get my little notes up out here. Back in, let's see, it was in October, I think. David Klinghoffer at the Discovery Institute put up a post: "If materialists are right about the brain, why no morality seizures?" Might get a seizure in your brain trying to make sense of what he thinks he's going on here. And the idea is that if evolution, he puts it, neuroscientist Michael Egnor explains. Michael Egnor is a medical doctor. I don't think he really qualifies as a neuroscientist, but he gets it here. Why, as a neurosurgeon, I believe in free will. And Egnor offers this point that why don't we have morality seizures? Why don't people with epilepsy occasionally have seizures in which they repeatedly keep the Sabbath, or involuntarily honor their father and mother, or compulsively don't covet? This never happens. So he's arguing that morality and ethics and religion can't possibly be related to brain systems, because epileptics ought to be having these things where if they were having a seizure, they become what? Extremely religious? Oh, but they can. And so, I started pulling up, I'll be putting in the links, a 1970 paper by Dewhurst and Beard, which is Sudden Religious Conversions in Temporal Lobe Epilepsy, from the British Journal of Psychiatry. There's Ogata and Miyazaki, 1998, that is on a related theme. And then there's Davinsky and Lai, 2008, who let me see, a review of the matter. And on top of which, it's also been suggested that some religious figures may have been epileptic. This has been argued about Muhammad And there's a posting from 2020 that I'll be sticking up from a Muslim apologist that really likes to go a bit too far in trying to play down the prospect that Muhammad may have been an epileptic. And St. Paul is another one that has been suggested may have been epileptic. And there's a 1987 paper by Lansborough on that. And all of those are open access, so I'll be sticking the links up onto that. There's an awful lot of technical literature, a lot of which I couldn't find open access for you to put up on it. But Michael Sherlock has done some stuff on the Mohammed epilepsy issue. And you've got, I think Borson and Brewer did a 1988 paper as well, St. Paul and temporal lobe epilepsy, where he was criticizing the St. Paul thing. See, the idea that religious figures might be getting some of their attitudes based upon the malfunctions and firings in the brain doesn't set well with the idea that they are just communing with gods. And so there's a natural opposition for them to go into this. Let's see. And then there's even some of the biology that you could go into if you wanted to about where epilepsy comes from in the brain. There are some genes connected to it. There are certain kinds of there's a small subunit of cytochrome C oxidase that causes Leigh-like syndrome and epilepsy. That was a 2016 study in brain. There's also the whole idea that our very notion of working out moral frameworks. Oh, David H says, always remember that it's such that people who are having seizures were thought to be demon possessed. Yeah, that's actually a relevant point. And if you think about, whoops, I clicked that. That's there. If you think about the whole bit of what happens in the brain when it's being normal, dream state is yet another one. If you think about what you are as an early human, trying to figure out what dreams mean, it's no coincidence that there's a whole subculture that built up, and drugs that could put you in a dreamlike state, hallucinogens and others play a part I'm sure, in the development of some religions, prophecies, the Pythia, the Oracle of Delphi. There'd be all sorts of things where people would go in and presumably get high on something and would experience all sorts of experiences that are outside of their normal world. And yet, why wouldn't they think that was, air quotes, real? So I can't blame our human species for doing that. But the issue is whether or not you take any of that seriously if it gets transcribed into what people's experiences are. In St. Paul's case, of course, supposedly he was on the road to Damascus. He'd been persecuting Christians like mad as Saul, and I think there was a guilty conscience playing a role here, assuming the stories took place as advertised. And a part of his brain during his epileptic seizures just basically conjures up an experience of Jesus chatting with him, and his own guilty conscience is talking to him. We can't prove that didn't happen. We can't prove it did happen. It's outside of our range to do that. But given the literature of what can happen with human beings, filtering their experience and trying to make sense out of things that are outside of their normal experience, that doesn't strike me as particularly eccentric. That eventually the neuroscientists are burrowing more and more into this area. And Vestas brings, if I remember correctly, in a split brain patient, one side was religious, the other side was an atheist. That's an interesting. I haven't heard about that one. If you have a technical reference on that, I would be most intrigued to make sure that I got it in my data field if I don't already have it in there. We know that when you have split brain, this is one of the reasons why studying malfunctions in human brains are so relevant, because it pulls the underpinning. Hey, IRJ, are you top again? I'm not sure. What does that mean? Am I top on what? I don't know. Am I ever on top? We'd see. But the point is that when you have cases where there have been seizures or lesions that have to be broken, separate two halves of the brain in order to cut down on that. You can have circumstances where, because you have motor systems that are specialized in one half of the brain, things can go on where one half of the brain is seeing stuff from one side. And also remember visually, the left side of the eye, that's sending it to the right side, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets processed in a weird way inside the brain. And the overbrain still wants to make sense of all that. So it will make up stories about why things happen when they give stimulus to one side of the brain or the other. All this makes perfect sense as the brain as a mechanical system, in a sense, that can have broken cams and all this sort of thing. Another related area that's really quite interesting is synesthesia, which is where people have modality overlaps. So people will hear color, see colors when they hear sounds, or may see colors when they are, or hear sounds when they read words. And so what's happening is sections of the brain that are adjacent to one another that don't normally check with other, except by going up to the main system, might have cross-wiring that's crossing information. And so the act of processing one thing is interacting with another, and it's treating it, well, excuse me, this is input that's supposed to be color, right? So I'm going to make sense of it and make color out of it, okay? And the brain can do that. My pet uncertain hypothesis is there's no necessary reason to think that Australopithecines, for example, might not have been heavily synesthetic, but because they didn't read letters and the like, it might not have been noticed. And that only in the course of millions of years did our brains continue to specialize to where designated sections of the brain now do specialized things without crosstalking. And so my suspicion is that the cognitive landscape of going as far back into the Australopithecines is a bit different from ours because they have crosstalking going on that's no longer operating in our derived species. That's a suspicion that I have. Now, what role that would play in the formations of religions and philosophical moral ethics and all sorts of other stuff, I haven't a clue yet. David says he hasn't read much on split brain as far as religion, but I've heard that the subconscious side can sometimes react violently towards some things that the conscious brain acts normal to. Yes, indefinitely. Yeah, definitely so. That an awful lot of processing in the brain goes on without you being aware of it. And the classic example that I like to think about as the benchmark of something that everybody can carry around and everybody's experienced is the moon illusion. When the moon looks so gigantic when it rises on the horizon, and then later on when it's up in the sky, it looks like a little bitty little thing. It's only about the size of your pinky finger held out at arm's length. It's not a very large image. But that's exactly how big it is when it looks so big on the horizon. Same size image. There's a tiny amount of magnification, but for all practical purposes, they're interchangeable. Best of 11th Dimension is an actual biogenesis researcher. Oh, bravo. That's absolutely delightful. Get in touch with our bunch on Twitter and other places where we can exchange information and deal with stuff. If you got want to be on the show sometime, let's do that. Chit chat about stuff. Biogenesis is such an absolutely interesting area. I've lived long enough to see an enormous amount of work done on the subject. It's an extremely intricate problem, way more difficult than figuring out how lightning works, and we're not entirely figured out that yet. And it involves virtually retro-engineering from existing biological systems, and then also coming forward from purely abiotic chemistry to try to figure out what pieces are doing what under what circumstances, and how different is it from conditions that we have now, and all that kind of stuff to build up a biological system. I'm inclined to think that when all the variables are worked out properly and experimenters put the stuff together, it's going to just go whoop, and in a relatively short pace of time generates the things that we eventually call living systems. But it might not necessarily be a strictly RNA DNA based thing. That will be playing a part, and it won't be identical to what we see in the hypothetical LUCA, last universal common ancestor organism. That's quite a ways down the road. Another area that I leave in my uh, categories as to abiogenesis is all the error correction systems that involve in DNA. To me, that's a really interesting issue. I don't think the original organism needed to have that, but how that came about and the fact that there's so many different little cross-checker things going on to try to minimize the impact of mutation, and make sure that there's a fidelity between the codon assignments and the amino acids that are assembled by them, even though there's a whole bunch of processes that can gum up the works and things can generate, and particular molecules can turn into another molecule if they're an oxygen atom is added to them or whatever. And so there's so many things going on that, to my mind, that's a fascinating part of that mid-range before we settle down in the organism that we get with LUCA, and that there was an awful lot of stuff going on prior to that. Mutable Destiny says, the biogenesis, as far as I can tell, needs more guidance from the geological conditions of the early Earth. You can develop many fascinating chemistries, but they must be similar to that of early Earth. Oh, well, yeah, by definition, whatever, if life originated naturally, it is making use of what conditions were in that circumstance. And one of the things that's only recently, and I'll put that in the chat here, the wet-dry issue, the wet-dry cycles, the wet-dry cycle issue is just really now hitting the fore in an awful lot of recent papers. And David Deemer, in his research with volcanic vents and all that kind of stuff, is reminding us of something that's been known a long time. I mean, this is not something that was a news bulletin. When the impactor event created the moon very early in our geological history, the moon started out really close to the Earth, just past the Roche limit part. And because of the transfer of angular momentum, and the Earth is also spinning quite quickly, I think 13 hours or something like that. As time goes on, the moon goes farther away from the Earth, and the Earth is slowing down in its rotation. And we're now at a 24-hour day, and the moon is out to the point where it can produce total eclipses of the sun because it just happens to be the same size. And maybe some of the conscious development of our culture came about in that period when the moon had finally reached the stage where it was doing eclipses of that type, when it wouldn't have been able to do that in previous periods. But anyway, if you think about what's going on, not only is the moon closer, by definition, any oceans that are in there, tides are happening much faster because the Earth is spinning faster, and they are higher. Tides that can sweep in over a continent. Now, remember, to begin with, there's no life going on. So what's happening are prebiotic things happening where you have water that's coming in and pulling away, and stuff is drying out until the next surge of water. And it's turning out that has some interesting abiogenesis chemical effects on consolidating things, on letting things relax for a bit, and then getting a new burst of stuff. And then, of course, you also have to put in material bubbling up from a volcanic plume. You have to think about clay substrates and how those impact with stuff. You got to figure out all the material blumping in by asteroids that are adding material to the mix, and a lot of stuff is going on. But the fact that it looks like life appears very early, as functionally soon as the impactor events have slowed down to the point where you can have a more stable sea, and also you're starting to get plate tectonics. That's another interesting issue, is the extent to which plate movement and the speed of plate movement plays a role in churning and recycling material in a way that's been favorable to life. Some of this may play a role way after life has already appeared, and to see what happens as to why it eventually ends up colonizing the land better. Of course, ozone, until you get enough oxygen in the atmosphere, you're going to have more ultraviolet light up on the surface, but that changes when you have more oxygen in the atmosphere. Oh, thank you. Mutable says the other major debate with the bio is regarding whether or not the conditions are saltwater, oceanic, or if life forms in freshwater environments. Deemer, I just watched a lecture by David Deemer from 2019 now. It's been back a ways. And there he's reporting on the research that hasn't yet fully been published. They're still wanting confirmation and more peer vetting and that on it. But there, Deemer is definitely making the argument life originated in freshwater, not saltwater. So it's not in the saltwater oceans. And that rules out a lot of models that might be thinking deep ocean vents, that it's up near the surface. And the other thing is, to what extent, regarding this ultraviolet light issue, to what extent is life in this early stage of a form that's much more resistant to the things that are problematic for LUCA in an environment with ultraviolet light? I'll put that up there. Let's hide that one. And we'll put this one up in here. We're getting some wonderful side confirmations. Different biological compounds need different conditions to form reasonably, and for that reason, you would imagine that geochemical diversity is more widespread on freshwater environments. I wasn't aware. Deemer didn't bring that up per se, but that's a useful side issue to deal with. And remember, if you have a series of metabolic cycles that are being built up prebiotically that do not involve replicators. They're not replicating organisms. They're just hypercycles that are producing chemical things, and formaldehyde is being modified, and ultraviolet light, lightning bolts, and chemical baths, and all sorts of stuff are going on. As yet, this is not a living system, but it provides masses of more and more complicated precursor materials that a living system can latch onto for food. That once the replicator gets going, it only needs to go once, somewhere in this gigantic planet of stuff going on. And now it's got the resources to work with. And since it's a replicator, it replicates and makes more of itself and eats. So provided that you can't eat yourself out of house and home, which is one of the arguments that's in favor, I at least find a good argument for, that you have to have these metabolic cycle systems running before the replicator gets started. Otherwise, it just eats itself out of its food base, and whoop, that's the end of that. Now, interesting thought, maybe that had happened multiple times. So the unresolved issue is whether or not you've got living systems generating before the metabolic cycle was sufficiently robust, that eats itself out of home and disappears. Then the other issue that is yet unresolved is how much of this is RNA, peptide, RNA, DNA, PNA, what various variations going on here, because we tend to become skewed to the idea that we're looking at the DNA RNA system that's found in LUCA as if that necessarily needed to be the earliest organism. It could have been the multiple one down the road, and then it proved to be better than the others, and it drives them all to extinction. Where you have a mass extinction event of all the rival biosystems, and the one that leads to LUCA is the one that won. In the same way that, look at all the Ediacara biota that were hogging the planet for millions of years before the Cambrian explosion, and all of them have become extinct because little organisms lurking in the sides that are the precursors of the metazoans we're more familiar with eventually just took over, and the other ones get driven to extinction in the same way trilobites eventually went to extinction. So, David, I wonder if it might be something besides salt fresh, but something else chemically initially. That's another prospect that people who are way more knowledgeable about the chemistry of oceans should be addressing, rather than me, history guy. But I haven't seen right off the bat technical work that's been thinking a lot about that. But we've got certain elements that are very, very common in living systems. And I do know, I think it's phosphorus, that when they were starting to intrude in them, I think Sutherland's work with hydrothermal vent models, things that were very difficult to do without phosphorus in the mix turned out to be really easy and automatic once they started putting phosphorus in the exchange system. And remember also the limitations of an experiment. You're trying to do stuff in the lab and figuring out what you need to do, plugging next to what in the little vial, dropping this in the little spark chamber and all that stuff. It's by necessity a simplification. And if some of the things that are needed to figure out how living systems develop involve a really big lab vat that's the size of an ocean, that spreads over a continent, that has all sorts of micro environments based upon plate movements and things, and that synergistically produces an effect, that's much harder to simulate if you don't know which pieces to put in. Goes from Terra Darwinia toward Luca. Yeah. We're still plugging around for nomenclature in this area, but I know, just because I'm an old fart, when I think of the baby step level of research in this area when I was young in the 60s and 70s, compared to where things are now in the 21st century, we know a lot more about the parameters of what's going on here. Planet-sized lab, yes, David is, yeah. And so one of the things that will be interesting to do if we can have a robust space program is, one, to send really serious science people out and our machines to Mars, which will be the easiest one initially, to see whether there was ever life there. And therefore, you have to be super duper careful not to contaminate it with anything, and whether there might still be life there. And if so, in either case, was it life as we know it or something else? And then the somewhat more difficult, rather more difficult environments are some of the moons of the outer gas giant planets that have curiously interesting environments that suggest that maybe life might even be developed there, Europa and other places like that. But they're cold and they're hard to get to. Europa, in fact, I think is inside of the frost your balls off radiation belts of Jupiter, and we're talking like 10,000 rads. I mean, this is so it's cold, difficult to get to, and perilous. So investigating these things won't be easy. Probably a little easier than tinkering around Venus, which is just horribly difficult to get to. Everything we land on there, you send a probe down and you go, okay, 5-10 minutes before the damn thing gets roasted and dissolved in the acid atmosphere, and we'll get the signal we can, folks. And that's about as far as it goes. There was briefly a flurry earlier in last year about the idea that there might be some kind of weird organism living in the atmosphere of Jupiter, or I mean of Venus. That was because there were some chemical signatures that apparently, supposedly, are only made by biological signals. But there's been some pushback on that, and it would be an amazing thing if it were true. But so maybe someday we'll want to be sending some probes out to Venus to be able to look at this and close things. But the main thing is we don't know entirely what the parameters of life are. All we know are the parameters of life as we know it. And it could be that life as we know it is the way life does. That life everywhere will be something like that. It will end up RNA, DNA based, with proteins made out of pretty much the same amino acids and all that kind of stuff. And there may not be an enormous amount of range on that. And this could apply even if gods are behind it. That there may even be limitations if you are a god who likes to go around making life. Maybe you're kind of limited in the kind of range that you can deal with. Since we have no other examples to go by, we can't help. But it's terribly interesting on that. So there's a sideline. I mean, I don't think I call this the origins or bust issue. And I'll type that in there so everybody can see that in the live chat replay. Origins or bust. It's a phrase that I've been delighted is starting to take on. People are using it because it's relating to how creationists approach the problem. And that is, they want to argue that, well, you don't know how life originated, so it must be, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, the particular God they believe in. Or we don't know how the elements or the universe or, fill in the blank, anything that's like that. It's an origins or bust argument, which is a way typically to avoid thinking about the parts we have worked out. And so shouldn't we deal with those? Because it's such an ubiquitous thing discussed in the creationist menu, it's almost impossible to find an anti-evolutionist who doesn't have a chapter in their book or a post on their website about biogenesis. They're not going to avoid it until and unless the scientific community figures out how life originated. Then there'll be some backpedaling and goalpost moving. But until we reach that stage where it's been rigorously worked out, it's a natural argument for them to use. And so anybody that wants to dive into it needs to be prepared, at least to be up to date on the current material, to not necessarily feel intimidated by it, because there are ways around that argument. For one thing, we have a benchmark to go by. So we know that life originated fairly quickly, around 4 billion years. It was bacterial in nature. And that story is not what you find in any religious documents. None of them. It's not just the Bible. They think about all sorts of magicy things, and they tend to think about organisms appearing full blown because that's how they're used to thinking of things. They didn't even know about bacteria, let alone which types, or whether or not they want to deal with Loki bacteria or Archaebacteria or thermophiles or all that. Nah, none of that. Now, a creator who had designed all of this stuff would have known, and so either didn't like to brag why the poor little goat herders couldn't understand that. Well, are you bad at explaining? You can come in there. Immutable destiny. There are conceptual problems with the origin of life also, namely what processes allow for the shift in the type of energy typically used in chemical reactions to autocatalytic chemistry. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I caution against anybody saying, well, we've worked out how life originated. No, but there are a lot of parameters about how life originated. I think no origin of, let me tell you some of the things that don't surprise anybody. Is there a shock that a lot of abundant elements are used in life? No. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Most of the universe is hydrogen still, and the hydrogen is as old as the universe. It starts very, very early. Carbon is a nice stable element with nice, easy bonding forms. It's much better than silicon, so it's a surprise that things that are built on carbon are found in life. Probably not. It may very well be. There's an argument as to why DNA as a base, as the main inheritance thing, is a nice molecule that forms stable bonds, but they're not so hard they can't be easily broken, but not too easily broken, as opposed to RNA, where although it can form double strands, they fall apart much easier than DNA. So it's just right, the Goldilocks molecules. Now you can argue, see how wonderful the designer was picking all of this stuff, or the reason is because that's what works. And there may be other systems that can do stuff, but ultimately get outcompeted. One of the models that I've been keeping track of is the idea that DNA has come along as kind of, in a way, a parasite that latched onto an RNA peptide system that had the advantage that RNA has catalytic properties that DNA doesn't, but doesn't have that nice stability. And that gradually DNA got to be a scaffolding that ends up as the core of what we regard as the replicating system. And trying to work out what that was doing ain't easy. And it's true for an awful lot of fundamental things. There's an awful lot of large fundamental molecules. Sal, the young Earth creationist, brings to mind the topoisomerases that are involved in the ribosome. And there's a lot of things that are large, squiggly molecules, and you have to wonder how they originated. And can they originate abiotically, or are they the product of prebiotic systems? And if so, what are they? It's lots and lots of stuff to do. But none of that makes the reptile mammal transition go away or make the book of Exodus any less irrelevant to a discussion of abiogenesis, because it doesn't describe any of that stuff. And neither does the Mahabharata or the Quran or any of these others. And I don't blame them for that omission if they're just human documents, because humans, well, how would they know what the hell was going on? They had no idea about the chronology of things. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't know about a lot of stuff. But I expect the creator of the universe to know. And so they should have been a little bit more proactive and a little bit more useful. And oh, by the way, ban slavery. Don't own people. That's bad. That's yeah. Nix that. Nix that. Okay. Ixnay on the Avery slave. Okay. Um. Oh, Slade said, love this conversation. Be curious if there's more regarding the neuroscience. Yeah, that's a huge area that I keep track of, in part because creationists don't, and largely aren't. I mean, calling Egnor a neuroscientist is really a stretch. And in the same way that Michael Denton and that occasionally gets described as a geneticist, no, he's a biochemist. It's not quite the same area. And the neuroscience part, we're now in a period when they can look at the brain doing its thing while we're looking at it, less invasively than it was before, where you had to run electrodes in. And so with MRI and CAT scans and the like, we can see a lot more about what's going on. But there's still an awful lot that is going to be a puzzle to things. If anyone around knows neuroscientists and that, which I haven't bumped into too many, that would love to test out my Tortugan model of mind, and that is that there are systems that in and of themselves are not, there's no spot in the brain that says I'm going to be a stupid bullshit numbskull. There's a set of things that end up doing that in some people. Each one of those components is not intrinsically bad. And so one of them is that thing I'm calling Matthew Harrison Brady syndrome, MHBS, which is a capacity to not think about certain things. That the brain has just a carapace in it, and it doesn't want to think about that part. And so there are things where a philosophy that permits you to not do that is one that you're going to like. And as information comes in that conflicts with it, the brain will deflect easily. And the problem is that such minds don't necessarily map onto things that are false. Nothing would prevent such a mind to believe only things that are true, but it would have exactly that same deflective structure. So if you ask, I got to put it in DNA likely evolved because it's more faithful replicator than RNA. It makes it easier to preserve the parent molecule. RNA has 2 free hydroxyl groups where DNA has 1. Well, there it is. And I too am of the suspicion that there's a reason why DNA became the molecule. It wasn't just stochastic chance of the luck of the draw. It's that it had properties that made it much more useful, and it eventually took over. Oh, David, it says someone wants to have slaves, let them live like one first. Yeah. This was Abraham Lincoln's position, where he was deriving morality. Of course, if you're an anti-slavery person, you don't really have many religions to fall back on, because they tended to be okay with slavery in one form or another, except in specialized circumstances. And Lincoln's position was pure reciprocity argument, that as I would not want to be a slave, so I would not want to be a master. And that kind of moral reasoning is very modern and contemporary. And it's the kind that I admire a great deal. It slides into kind of things where you would be talking about pragmatism, William James style, good old William James. By the way, if you haven't read a lot about William James, you should. It's insufferably brilliant. One of the founders of American psychology, 19th century guy, lived into the early 20th century, and was terribly bright and curious about tons of stuff. And most of his books, I think, are available online, and you can be able to get some stuff that he was doing in the 1870s and 80s, and famous essays that he was doing, like The Will to Believe and all that, that are really neat. And other than his attraction to psychic research, which was very common when he was alive, and doesn't surprise me that he was interested in it. He wasn't a pushover on it, but he was very favorably open to it. And that remained really the case for an awful lot of scientifically minded people all the way down until the 1980s or so, when it became increasingly difficult to avoid the roles of fraud and second guessing and luck and all that. And a lot of the old classic work, including scientific minds that tried to do psi research. Oh gosh, I suddenly forgot his name, with the invented Zener cards and all of the um, 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 Yeah, I'm having a brain fart just to remember his name. That they were legitimately trying to develop a scientific sci research, and you found still a lot of science fiction writers in the 60s and 70s. It shows up in Star Trek and others that they were thinking that there could be a psychic power that theoretically beings might use, and it still shows up in science fiction and fantasies today. But I think your typical skeptic minds are very, very skeptical of that it's actually a wishful thinking thing, and that there isn't any such thing as telekinesis or precognition or any of these other aspects. That as much as we'd like to do that, um, and one argument that you could use to make us very skeptical is, why isn't there a Mozart of psychic phenomena? In other words, you would expect, if anything is a natural property, that there's once in a while going to be people that are just unbelievably good at it. And so you could have somebody who really does have telekinetic powers, and they can lift the table, like Yoda in pulling the ship up in Star Wars, or do recognition reliably, or that sort of thing. They'd be maybe rare, but you'd account for them occasionally. Whereas it looks like everybody that looks like they can do that, when they start controlling for fraud, turns out they're just cheating. And so the Uri Gellers and all the rest don't want to get around the late James Randi or anybody that operates like that. And so even though I had an open view on psychical research when I was growing up, I've come to the camp where, yeah, I don't think it's real. And you'd need really powerful evidence to suggest that it does, although you still find people in the Rupert Sheldrake pops up every once in a while. He's still very busy thinking that they're psychic dogs and all sorts of neat stuff that he does some semi-control work on. It's interesting kind of stuff. So J.B. Ryan, thank you. Nobody important there. Let me put that up. Yeah, J.B. Ryan. Ooh, there we go. J.B. Ryan. It's far enough back because his stuff really is like 50s and 60s and even earlier. And I actually have a set of Zener cards, which are those little psychic things with the little. If you've seen Ghostbusters, Zener, big, great big Zener cards are used in that. Monstrous ones. The one deck I have is a little bitty thing like that. And I did some experiments with some of my friends and stuff back in the 60s where we tried to measure stuff, and everything we did when you were trying to do recognition showed up at chance. So, but it's a funky little thing to do, and it is a way. Ryan did that approach because it meant that you could calculate probabilities of whether or not it was chance or not very, very easily, because you only had 5 symbols to work with, and so you could do them over and over and over and over and over again and be able to determine whether or not you had chance or not. And most people, even in his own work, only seem to be chance, and only once in a while did you see something otherwise that looks like, in retrospect, was either some data selection or bad statistics or cheating. So David says, I think if such things as psychic, telekinesis, etc., did exist, it is so small we could be like asking a mouse to push a building over. Yeah, we get into the same issue with quantum theory. There's a branch of physicists who think that maybe our consciousness depends upon quantum phenomenon and the like. And remember, in principle, Richard Dawkins has mentioned this, that in principle, the statue of the Virgin Mary could be like this with its hand up, and theoretically, all of the little particles in that hand could suddenly go in the same direction, and the stone seemed to wave to you. The odds of that happening are so vanishingly unlikely that in that case, he'd say that's probably a miracle to do that, because that's more plausible than the idea that all those little Brownian movements could all work together, which is the same reason why we don't see that happening a lot, as like at all. It's tempting to think that quantum phenomenon, it's weird, it's action at a distance, it's all sorts of strange stuff that's going on, could theoretically offer an opportunity for that, but it still has to get past the snag that it doesn't seem to happen in the bigger world. Once you get up past the quantum level, everything seems to be very drearily mechanistic, that no matter how devout you are, saints do not fall slower than sinners. And no matter how devout you are, taking a window out of a 5th floor building is not a good idea. that gravity is going to do its thing, and all of that won't affect quantum theory. You know, Heisenberg's cat is going to take the same amount of time to get to the ground as Schrodinger's cat and your cat, and it won't make any difference involved in that. So any model that posits that such phenomenon can be real. Now, you could theoretically do a science fiction story where you could take these effects and somehow amplify them, maybe, and come up with a nice plot about that and make delightful stuff. Or just simply write a story in which you're positing what would that be and what are the social consequences of it. And that's the kind of stuff that an H.G. Wells and that would do, and a lot of science fiction writers will do, where you don't have to worry about whether it's real or not. Just like you don't have to worry about whether or not your faster than light drive will work, but you think through the consequences of that and make an interesting story about it. Oh, Mr. Nielsen, hi all. Yep. I've been on almost an hour in here, rambling on a lot of stuff. Not nearly enough neuroscience for Slade. Since so much of my criticism of creationism involves their arguments that have come up, and they discuss so little about neuroscience, it really doesn't come up a hell of a lot. Hopefully, Jackson and I will be doing a book in the future on the structure of the mind and how it relates to religion and where all that comes from, and that'll inevitably go into the current understanding of where self-awareness is and whether or not we have a free will or not. Apologia, who's one of the patrons for the project here, I say, I'd like to have a chat with you about free will, because he's a non-free will guy. And I'd like to make the case for at least a provisional, limited form of free will. And I think that'd be an absolutely delightful discussion on there. And it does not involve quantum theory. It doesn't require that at all. It comes at it from a very, very different direction. But it does, I hope, keep up on the idea. There's somebody who just can't stand the idea that free will might be real is Jerry Coyne. I mean, you can find his positions repeated almost like clockwork. He's just obsessed with distaste for the idea that there could be any kind of free will structure. But I have it in a nutshell. It involves the idea that there are different brain systems inside of us that are somewhat independent of one another. And like a mirror reflecting another mirror, reflecting another mirror synergistically, stuff goes on in that's more than the sum of the mirrors. And the same phenomenon that produces our sense of consciousness, which is, that's another one I would argue, I don't think it is quite an illusion in the way some people would use that word of illusion as being an unreal thing. I think that's also where this free will-ish thing comes from in our mind as to how we initiate intentions and desires. So there it is. David, he says, hard to talk about the brain when so many religions teach thought-stopping techniques. Well, there is a side to that that's very relevant. And that is that we do know that a lot of mystic traditions have things that you can actually put in the lab and study that can seemingly interact with what seems normally to be completely automatic systems. So slowing down breathing and moving into other areas where sections of the brain can start shutting down in ways that are volitional, that most people don't do. Things happen in meditative states, and also you're accessing other things. A thing that I love to point out is that the brain systems that light up when people do meditation, and this can be a Catholic nun, it can be a Sufi, it can be a Zen Buddhist, it doesn't matter what the content and religious framework is, but when you get into this meditative state, the brain systems that are really kicking in are the ones that also light up during sexual arousal. Well, no wonder they feel good. And so there's an example of how a brain system can be co-opted and take on a novel impact by disabling or slowing down the interactions that it's having with other brain systems. And because there's lots of stuff going on in our little meat computer. I don't think I need to abandon the brain is a mechanistic system in which we end up being conscious and have a certain amount of free will, not unlimited, but a certain amount. In other words, that your decision to eat potato chips rather than corn chips is not absolutely dictated by the biology, in the same way that your decision to not chop off your neighbor's head or drop a rock on your toe is not typically something that is completely devoid of intention and will. And so that's my position. And so, Paul, gee, we should have a talk about this sometime. And also with your partner there. I mean, she's a neuroscientist and a psychologist, and so she has a familiarity on that area as well. I think it'd be a very fruitful discussion because it's something that divides people in some respects unnecessarily, I think. And oh, by the way, also this discussion would relate to qualia, the wonderful word qualia. There's a word that if you haven't bumped into that, you should. That Oh, I talk about, like, for example, some people literally cover their eyes and shout, yell, scream their scriptures when they block out forbidden knowledge. That's a Tortugan mind shell phenomenon. Yeah. Qualia is why does red look red? Why does a sound have a sound it does? Why does something taste as it does? And from what I understand, and this is another one that Shannon could probably grapple with even more on a discussion with Paulogia, is that it's not possible to really figure out what's going on in another person's mind on aspects of qualia. That no experiment can be devised that could tell you whether or not I am experiencing the same color red as somebody else. You can measure the wavelengths of the red. You can measure the firing of the eyeballs and the processing of the circuitry, and you can comparatively say, I think this is a different shade of red than the other one, and you can put them all. And yet, are we both seeing the same red? Are we perceiving the same redness in our little movie in the brain? That's another phrase I really like. The movie in the brain, the Cartesian theater is another one. Movie in the brain. Cartesian theater. It's another couple term that I love the imagery of, and that is, we all seem to be in this world where we're looking out through our eyeballs. That's in a way an illusion, but yet that's what we perceive, and it's a fairly reliable illusion because it allows us to walk across the room and pick up things and not bump into the cat and all that sort of stuff. And why that is so, and what is going on in the brain when that happens, and can other beings have levels of that? So does a bat have its own Cartesian dream going on? Quality, the wet dream. Ooh, the wet dream of neuroscientists. Hey, immutable. I like that one. That's a good one. Yeah, these are ultimately, I think, qualia and free will are undecidable propositions. There's a thing that I did on NOMA Revisited at my website. Remember that www.tortugan.wordpress.com I keep on telling everybody about? I did a talk on this, and there's a posting on it in PDF that you can download, share it around, read it. It's not huge long. I think it's about 10 or 15. Anyway, it's where I laid out my version of Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisterium argument, which has gotten flack. Oh my gosh, Jerry Coyne lights into it all the time, as do religionists who don't like it. This dividing line between religion and science, and that. And I argue, in a nutshell, that Gould got it almost right, but the line is in the wrong spot. It's not religion and science. It's between decidable and undecidable propositions, which is ultimately the dividing line between science that deals with objective empirical phenomena that are true whether you like it or not, and undecidable propositions that are normative in nature, presuppositional in nature, and that they might be true, but you can't decide. You can only act as if they are true or not. That's more discussion for Apologia. There's philosophy going on here. And I think it's a useful distinction that I would like to make, because ironically, I think Jerry Coyne, when push comes to shove, has the same position I do. He also agrees that you can't get thought from is. The naturalistic fallacy is still a fallacy. You can't get morality from science. And any attempt to do that, I contend, is stamping across the divide between decidable and undecidable propositions. So there we have our little thing. That I draw to some extent on William James. I draw to some extent on William Clifford, the guy who argued that you should never believe anything without sufficient evidence. But William James says, what if there are things that are true? This is the thing in the will to believe. What if there are things that are true that you can't get sufficient evidence for? Are you never supposed to believe things that are true just because you can't get to that sufficient evidence argument? And I argued in that James was reminding Clifford of that undecidable proposition boundary without realizing that's what it was, because I have a different nomenclature on it. So anyway, that's my brain is free now. Yes. That puts that little element in on it. There's an awful lot of stuff, and because these are undecidable propositions, they're never going to go away. They're not going to be resolvable, just as qualia issues and that are functionally unresolvable, and you might be able to get a general consensus on, but not necessarily resolved to the satisfaction of hyper-persnickety reductionists, and as well as hyper-persnickety presuppositional religionists. So that's the way it goes. Anyway, we're past the hour. I've been on a tad longer than that because I started just shortly beforehand. And 11th dimension, RJ, what do you think of Plato's cave? It's a misleading argument. The argument that there's a reality that we're only seeing the shadows of. And remember, Plato lived in a pre-scientific age. He didn't know about neuroscience and all the rest. And I think it's a not useless analogy, but it doesn't necessarily apply well, because an awful lot of the things he was thinking about, it included also the physical appearance of things, was largely irrelevant. That our sensory processing system is actually pretty good at giving us the reality of things within range. But when we get down to quantum phenomena and all that, I bet that Plato would have had a connection to it if he had been told about the weirdness of the actual universe, and how much that he didn't know diddly squat. I think Aristotle would have been in the same boat on it. So it's a little entry of the door. You could think of an awful lot of Plato's writing as like the Wikipedia of philosophy. And it's a nice place to gather together some of the issues, but you don't want to stop there. You want to move on and not be restricted to it. So there's very, very little. But the only area that I am kind of a closet Platonist is in my notions about mathematics. Another one of my little phrases is the universe is what mathematics does for a living. You can quote me on that. And I think mathematics is, in a sense, I'm on my little laptop here, so it's very easy for my fingers to fungle up on that little bitty keyboard. That's a concept that I have, that everything in the universe ultimately is reducible to mathematics, and everything in mathematics ultimately has a thing in the universe, and that it's not arbitrary, that even weird mathematics like transfinite numbers and surreal mathematics and all of that have, in a way, a reality, whether we like it or not. And if you say, what is the shape of things in mathematics? Well, that's the universe. So the universe is what mathematics does for a living. It's utterly unprovable. It's completely axiomatic and presuppositional. But when I found out, for example, that subatomic particles are structured according to group theory, which had been thought an absolutely useless branch of mathematics, having no connection whatsoever to anything in the physical universe as of 1910. But it turned out that no, actually, things, Freeman Dyson brought this up in one of his lectures one time, that reminds me of things. Think that, yeah, maybe what if there's an isomorphism between the universe and mathematics? And that's the reason why you have things of Fibonacci series and all these other things that occur, because that's what mathematics does. There is no mathematics entity to do that. It's purely a metaphor, like Plato's cave. And we'll see whether or not my metaphor of the universe being what mathematics does for a living is any more useful than Plato's cave is. Well, on that note, I think I should pull the plug for the night. Hopefully, the electoral count will be done, and there won't be more rampaging nutballs in Congress for a while, and then we'll fiddle out what to do for the next 2 weeks to get down to the inauguration, and then see what happens to President Braindead after he ceases to be president and goes off tomorrow. I'll go to sulk for a while or whatever else to wait for the lawsuits to hit. There we go. Yes. Yeah, let me put that up so everybody can see that. There we go. Yes, don't be a slave to stupidity. Wear a proper mask correctly when you're out, and wash your hands properly. Keep your loved ones safer. We try to do that we've been doing that in Washington State quite a ways down the road. We've had masks mandates. We don't have lockdowns here. We have things where a lot of restaurants are in a bit of trouble because they don't have outside seating that they can work with. We've got that new strain of the thing coming up here, but I just went up to the store and bought stuff. People are doing commerce. We're not grinding to a halt, but to be smart. And you put on a mask, you be mindful of all of these things. And the nincompoops who argue that, well, I'm healthy and I don't have it. I'm not worried about catching it from somebody else. And we're going, we don't care about you. It's that you might be spreading the disease to somebody else. And we can't tell that because, well, you got a little meter around there telling you where the COVID virus is. No, the tiny things are microscopic. So this is absolutely a matter of separating between people that can behave reasonably and people that are jerks. And there are way too many jerks and way too much politicization of all of this. And I'm afraid that this is way too important an issue to get wrong. And I don't want anybody, even nincompoop Trumpistas, to die needlessly from this. So there we go. So that is on that. Immutable destination. Mathematics seems to be something very constructed in nature as opposed to being a fluid property of the universe. That too is deep philosophy as to whether or not any of things like constants or the nature of equal MC square, if any of these things, are they non-negotiable? Is every universe got to use them, or can they be variable like tuning the knobs on a stereo system? That's another big issue that comes up in the discussions of gods and all of that because of all of the anthropic arguments. And we're getting some sort of Amber Alert here on the phone here. Yeah, we got a thing there. Anyway, so see you all next week. Everybody stay safe. And there'll be more Creation is Stupid to discuss and the endless world when we finish off the biogeography chapter in Jensen and move on to chapter 5. And I'm happy with everybody that has supported the project and stuck with me through thick and thin, because all the patrons who have held on this. This is a dicey, worried time for everybody. So I'm very, very grateful to everybody that's helped on this. So stay safe, everybody. Keep going. Don't accept any wooden penguins. And see you next week.